Behind every great man is a great woman. But what if that woman was also a strategist, a power broker, and a force of her own? Welcome to Whispers of the White House, the show where we explore the untold stories of America's most powerful women. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on Lady Bird Johnson, a First Lady known for her grace, loyalty, and quiet strength. But there's far more to her story than wildflowers and loyalty to Lyndon. Her relationships with two of LBJ's most trusted advisors, Jack Valenti and Bill Moyers, sparked whispers of something deeper. Were they her trusted allies, emotional support, or something more? And how did Lady Bird use these relationships to influence some of the most pivotal moments in American history? Today, we'll explore the personal, political, and often hidden power of Lady Bird Johnson, her role in shaping LBJ's presidency, her impact on civil rights, and her mission to beautify and reshape America. And of course, we'll examine the whispers about her relationships with Valenti and Moyers and what they reveal about Lady Bird's true influence. Stay with us. This is one episode you won't want to miss. Before we dive into the rumors and relationships, let's start with a look at Lady Bird herself. Who was she, and how did she rise to become one of the most influential First Ladies in American history? Born Claudia Alta Taylor in Karnak, Texas, she was given the nickname Lady Bird as a child, a name that would stick with her for life. She grew up in a wealthy but emotionally distant household, where she developed a love for nature, education, and self-sufficiency. Her marriage to Lyndon B. Johnson was, by all accounts, a partnership as much as it was a love story. While LBJ was brash, ambitious, and deeply flawed, Lady Bird was calm, strategic, and emotionally grounded. From the very beginning, she served as his political partner. She invested in his congressional campaigns and later managed his finances. It's no stretch to say that without Lady Bird's support, there might never have been President Lyndon B. Johnson. And LBJ will get his own episode. Trust me, you won't want to miss that one. Once in the White House, Lady Bird defied the traditional role of the decorative First Lady. She took on active roles in civil rights, environmental advocacy, and media relations. Her Highway Beautification Act may seem like a flower project on the surface, but it was much more than that. It was an effort to reshape the public image of America, a symbolic and literal transformation of how people experience the country. But while she made headlines for her environmental work, her influence behind the scenes was even more significant. Lady Bird had LBJ's ear in a way no one else did. She was a steady voice in moments of crisis, a political advisor when others were too afraid to speak up, and a strategic thinker whose soft words often carried sharp power. Every great strategist knows they need strong allies, and for Lady Bird, those allies were Jack Valenti and Bill Moyers. But who were these men, and how did they become so closely linked to Lady Bird? Valenti was a Houston public relations expert who helped run LBJ's presidential campaign in Texas. After JFK's assassination, Valenti was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight, standing beside LBJ and Lady Bird as Lyndon took the oath of office on Air Force One. From that day forward, Valenti became a key advisor to the Johnson administration. Charming, good-looking, and magnetic, Valenti wasn't just a political insider. He became a friend and confidant to Lady Bird. Their public closeness fueled whispers. Why was Valenti always by her side? Why did they attend so many events together, especially when LBJ was absent? Some believed Lady Bird found comfort in Valenti's charm, especially given the known strains in her marriage to LBJ. On the other side of the spectrum was Bill Moyers, a young Texan journalist turned political aide. Quiet, intellectual, and morally driven, Moyers became LBJ's press secretary and later one of his most trusted speechwriters, but his influence extended beyond his official role. Moyers often met with Lady Bird privately, discussing philosophy, civil rights, and the deeper moral challenges of the era. Unlike Valenti's public show of loyalty, Moyers had a quieter, more personal bond with Lady Bird. Their connection was rooted in shared values and intellectual respect. Some wondered if this deep emotional connection was simply friendship or something more. Washington is a city of power, proximity, and whispers, and when people started seeing Jack Valenti and Bill Moyers spending so much time with Lady Bird, the rumors began to fly. Valenti's constant presence with Lady Bird at public events raised more than a few eyebrows in Washington's notoriously watchful social circles. As one of Lyndon B. Johnson's closest aides, Jack Valenti had every reason to be near the First Family. After all, he was part of LBJ's inner circle. But his proximity to Lady Bird seemed to go beyond professional obligation. He wasn't just present at White House dinners or official receptions. He was often seen walking beside her, sitting with her at state functions, and even accompanying her to social and cultural events when LBJ was elsewhere. Unlike other aides who might have hovered in the background, Valenti was front and center. Photos from the era show him leaning in during conversations with Lady Bird, his body language suggesting intimacy and familiarity. He was one of the few men seen openly smiling and engaging with her during public events. This was notable in a White House known for its strictly hierarchical and often emotionally distant tone set by LBJ himself. Washington insiders, always eager to find meaning in proximity, couldn't help but notice. For some, it was a natural partnership. Valenti was charismatic, polished, and endlessly charming, traits that made him the perfect public escort for Lady Bird at social engagements. When LBJ was busy with pressing political matters, Valenti was there, filling the role of second-in-command at her side. But for others, the sight of them together fed into a more scandalous narrative. Valenti's loyalty to Lady Bird seemed almost too complete. Why was he always the one by her side? Why was it always him and not one of the other senior aides? Washington is a city of whispers, and when the whispers started, they didn't stop. Some suggested that Lady Bird, who was well aware of her husband's long history of infidelity, had found emotional support, and perhaps even affection, with Valenti. After all, while LBJ was known for his power plays and affairs, Lady Bird had always been seen as the loyal, dutiful wife. But proximity is power, and in Washington, power is never without suspicion. Her constant appearances with Valenti gave rise to rumors that Lady Bird was quietly reclaiming some of her own. To be clear, there is no documented evidence of a romantic affair between Lady Bird and Valenti, but evidence in Washington isn't always required for people to believe a story. Those close to Lady Bird dismissed the rumors, calling them absurd and tabloid gossip. Yet there was something undeniable about the chemistry between them. Jack Valenti himself spoke glowingly of Lady Bird in interviews long after the Johnson administration had ended, often calling her one of the most intelligent and perceptive women he'd ever known. His respect for her was clear, but for many, his adoration was what drew attention. Unlike LBJ, who was larger than life, often crass and impulsive, Valenti was smooth, eloquent, and deliberate. He knew how to make people feel seen and valued, and for a first lady living under the constant shadow of her husband's indiscretions, this difference might have felt like a welcome change. While LBJ's extramarital affairs were Washington's worst-kept secret, some speculated that Lady Bird had quietly struck her own balance. If her husband had emotional connections beyond their marriage, perhaps she had the same right. Adding fuel to the fire was the fact that Valenti was so fiercely loyal to Lady Bird even after LBJ's presidency ended. Long after his White House tenure, Valenti continued to praise Lady Bird in public, crediting her with much of his own personal and professional growth. While his connection to LBJ is well documented, his deep admiration for Lady Bird often came up unprompted in interviews. It was as if he wanted people to know that she wasn't just the president's wife, she was a force in her own right. One notable story involves Lady Bird's Highway Beautification Act, a project that initially faced heavy opposition from lawmakers and business interests. Valenti is said to have played a behind-the-scenes role in helping Lady Bird craft her messaging and strategy. This was more than just a public relations maneuver. It was a mission Valenti took personally. He wasn't simply helping Lady Bird with a pet project. He was actively guiding her campaign for one of the most visible public works programs of the Johnson administration. Those in Washington noted that his loyalty to Lady Bird often seemed as intense as his loyalty to LBJ. He didn't just follow orders from the president. He actively championed the causes Lady Bird cared about, sometimes more passionately than other White House aides. His public admiration for her, coupled with his constant presence, made their relationship feel different from the usual First Lady advisor dynamic. While most presidential aides work to elevate the image of the president, Valenti seemed just as focused on elevating Lady Bird's profile and legacy. It's also worth noting that Jack Valenti had no reason to stay as close to Lady Bird as he did after his White House tenure ended. After LBJ left office, Valenti transitioned into one of the most powerful positions in Hollywood as the head of the Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA. Yet, even in that role, one that had nothing to do with Lady Bird or politics, he continued to speak about her with deep affection. He didn't have to mention her, but he did, repeatedly. This enduring connection left some wondering if Valenti's attachment to Lady Bird had been more personal than professional. Their relationship may have been entirely innocent, but in Washington, perception can often be more powerful than reality. Proximity, constancy, and admiration were all there. And in a White House where power players jostled for influence, Valenti and Lady Bird's connection stood out. Whether it was emotional support, admiration, or something unspoken, their closeness was undeniable. One thing is certain, Lady Bird Johnson was not a passive participant in the Johnson White House. Her relationships with key players like Valenti helped solidify her influence. Whether the rumors about their closeness were true or not, it's clear that Lady Bird knew how to cultivate loyalty and support from those in LBJ's orbit. Valenti's constant presence at her side wasn't just a sign of affection, it was a sign of power. Then there was Bill Moyers, the quiet but deeply insightful journalist turned political aide. Unlike the magnetic and ever-present Jack Valenti, Moyers moved in the background, preferring thoughtful reflection over spectacle. But his relationship with Lady Bird Johnson was no less curious. Where Valenti's connection to Lady Bird played out in the public eye, Moyers and Lady Bird shared their moments in private, away from the cameras and watchful eyes of Washington insiders. Often, they were seen walking together on the White House grounds, deep in conversation. Staffers and aides noticed these strolls weren't your typical check-in meetings. There was something more intimate about them. Their body language was telling. Heads bent closely together, slow steps as if each conversation carried weight. It was clear they weren't just discussing policy points or White House schedules. Their connection felt more personal, almost as if they were speaking about matters of the heart, not just matters of state. Unlike Valenti, who exuded charm and polish, Moyers was introspective and sincere. He wasn't flashy, nor was he one to seek the spotlight. Instead, he built his power through moral clarity and intellectual depth. As one of LBJ's most trusted speechwriters and press secretaries, Moyers had a rare role in the administration. He wasn't afraid to speak hard truths to the president himself. But insiders noted that Lady Bird valued Moyers' advice in a way that seemed different from her relationship with other senior aides. Some speculated that their relationship was rooted in shared values. Lady Bird was deeply committed to environmental reform, social welfare, and civil rights, and Moyers was one of the few people in LBJ's inner circle who shared these ideals with the same level of passion. Unlike Valenti, who was a master of optics and public image, Moyers was driven by principle and philosophical reflection. During tense moments in the administration, particularly around the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Moyers and Lady Bird reportedly had several one-on-one conversations about how to handle the fallout from the southern states. It was Lady Bird, not LBJ, who embarked on a southern-speaking tour to promote civil rights. Many believe Moyers was one of the key figures who encouraged her to take that bold step. Together, they crafted messages and speeches that struck a balance between moral clarity and political pragmatism. For Lady Bird, it was a moment to show she was more than just a first lady. She was an advocate for justice. There's another reason the whispers about Lady Bird and Moyers began to swirl. LBJ's infidelities were no secret. Lady Bird had long been aware of her husband's affairs, and some in Washington believed she might have found her own emotional refuge in Moyers. After all, Moyers was thoughtful, caring, and attentive, qualities her husband was not known for. While LBJ was unpredictable and prone to fits of rage, Moyers was calm, even-keeled, and consistent. If Lady Bird sought an emotional escape, it's not hard to imagine that she found it in her quiet walks with Moyers. There was also something strikingly different about the way Moyers approached Lady Bird. Unlike Valenti, who admired Lady Bird's influence and openly praised her in interviews, Moyers never publicly drew attention to their relationship. He rarely spoke about Lady Bird in public, and when he did, his words were measured and respectful. This discretion only added to the mystique surrounding their connection. Unlike Valenti, whose admiration felt like a public love letter, Moyers' reverence felt deeply personal. Some have suggested that Moyers was, in many ways, the intellectual equal Lady Bird never had in her marriage to LBJ. While Lyndon was a political powerhouse, he wasn't exactly a reflective thinker. He moved on instinct, raw ambition, and brute political force. Lady Bird, however, valued nuance, education, and deep philosophical inquiry. Moyers matched her in that way. Their walks through the White House gardens were described as conversations of equals, where Lady Bird wasn't just listening, she was leading. It's also worth noting that Moyers' relationship with Lady Bird wasn't subject to the same public scrutiny as Valenti's. Perhaps it was because Moyers, unlike Valenti, didn't play the role of her public escort. Their connection was quieter, more intellectual, and far less performative. But for those who did take notice, the subtlety of their relationship only added to the mystery. Why was Lady Bird walking with Moyers so often? Why was he one of the few people she trusted to speak candidly? And why did it feel like their discussions went deeper than White House policy? Over time, Moyers' influence on Lady Bird became undeniable. She sought his perspective on key issues like civil rights, education, and her own projects like the Highway Beautification Act. While Valenti was busy helping her with the optics of the initiative, managing public support and lobbying lawmakers, it was Moyers who helped her craft the moral argument for it. Their long talks on the White House lawn shaped not just the messaging around her work, but also her confidence to see it through. And then there was their shared humanity. In many ways, Lady Bird and Moyers had a similar emotional burden. LBJ was known for being ruthless with his staff, humiliating them in front of others. Moyers himself experienced this. In one infamous instance, LBJ berated Moyers in front of senior staffers, an incident that reportedly left him shaken. It was Lady Bird who pulled him aside later to offer comfort and reassurance. Their shared experience of managing LBJ's emotional volatility may have deepened their bond. But just as with Valenti, there is no concrete evidence that Lady Bird and Moyers had a romantic or inappropriate relationship. Some of the whispers likely stemmed from a sexist double standard. At the time, women in positions of influence, particularly women like Lady Bird who had emotional connections with men in power, were automatically viewed with suspicion. The idea that a first lady could have meaningful platonic friendships with men wasn't easily accepted. Washington insiders were more likely to believe something inappropriate was happening behind the scenes. The truth is, we may never know the full nature of Lady Bird's relationship with Bill Moyers, but what we do know is that he was one of her most trusted advisors, one of her deepest emotional connections, and one of the few men who truly saw her as more than the president's wife. Unlike Lyndon, who saw his marriage to Lady Bird as part of his larger political career, Moyers seemed to see Lady Bird as an individual in her own right. For a first lady who had spent years being defined by her husband's ambitions, that kind of connection must have felt profoundly meaningful. Some say Moyers' enduring respect for Lady Bird was proof that their bond was never inappropriate. But others see that respect as evidence of something much deeper, an emotional intimacy that was hidden from public view but felt strongly by those close to the Johnsons. Whether their relationship was romantic, emotional, or simply one of shared purpose, one thing is clear. Lady Bird and Moyers had a connection that was as much about what wasn't seen as it was about what was. Their shared ideals, quiet moments of reflection, and deep mutual respect were the kinds of connections that power is built on. But in Washington, where gossip often runs faster than the facts, their quiet walks on the White House lawn became the kind of scene that fueled whispers. Was it friendship, emotional support, something more? While no diaries, letters, or hard evidence exist to support the rumors of romantic entanglements, Washington didn't need proof. Proximity to power is often enough to fuel speculation. The whispers about Lady Bird's relationships with Valenti and Moyers weren't just gossip. They were reflections of a broader question. How much power did Lady Bird Johnson really have? We may never know for sure. But as with so many stories of powerful women in history, the truth often lies somewhere between what was seen and what was whispered. Lady Bird Johnson's influence on policy went far beyond her relationships with Valenti and Moyers. While she is often remembered as a quiet, composed First Lady, her role in shaping the Johnson administration's agenda was anything but passive. She was, in many respects, a silent architect of some of the most transformative changes of the 20th century. Her impact on civil rights, education reform, and most famously the Highway Beautification Act, cemented her legacy as one of the most effective First Ladies in American history. When people hear about the Highway Beautification Act, they often dismiss it as Lady Bird's Flower Project, a quaint initiative to line America's highways with wildflowers. But this is a vast oversimplification. Her goal wasn't just about making the roads look pretty, it was about reshaping how Americans saw themselves, their communities, and their country. Lady Bird believed that a more beautiful America was a more moral and unified America. At a time when the country was grappling with racial tensions, urban blight, and the visual chaos of industrial growth, she saw beauty as a way to inspire hope and pride. By limiting the number of billboards, junkyards, and unsightly industrial clutter along America's highways, Lady Bird aimed to create an environment that reflected America's ideals: dignity, order, and natural beauty. But it wasn't easy. The advertising industry fought back hard. Billboards were a multi-million-dollar business, and industry lobbyists argued that beautifying highways would hurt local economies and reduce advertising opportunities for small businesses. The trucking industry also opposed the act, claiming that junkyards provided vital support services for truckers on the road. Lady Bird faced fierce resistance from these lobbyists, many of whom had deep ties in Congress, but she wasn't one to back down. She lobbied lawmakers personally, meeting with them one-on-one to make her case. She didn't rely on charm alone. She came armed with data, photographs, and a simple but profound argument. Americans deserve to see their country's natural beauty, not just the clutter of consumerism. Her campaign was relentless. With the support of figures like Jack Valenti, who helped craft the public messaging around the project, she turned the issue into a matter of patriotism. She framed it not as an aesthetic choice but as a moral obligation to preserve the nation's landscape. By tying the cause to broader ideas of American virtue, she flipped the narrative. Her persistence paid off. Congress eventually passed the Highway Beautification Act in 1965, though it was significantly watered down from her original vision. Still, Lady Bird had achieved something remarkable. She had taken on a powerful lobby and won. More importantly, she had redefined the scope of what a First Lady could accomplish. This wasn't a pet project or a ceremonial duty. It was legislative work, complete with negotiation, lobbying, and strategy. Lady Bird had successfully wielded political power from within the shadows of the Johnson White House. Today, Americans still see her legacy as they drive along highways lined with wildflowers, free from the visual chaos of excessive billboards and scrap metal heaps. Her vision is etched into the landscape itself. When most people think about civil rights and the Johnson presidency, they think of Lyndon B. Johnson, the man who signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But behind those landmark bills was Lady Bird Johnson, quietly working to shift public sentiment and soften resistance in the South. Lyndon Johnson had spent his entire political career as a Southern Democrat, a political identity that carried with it the weight of Dixiecrat segregationist ideology. When he decided to push for civil rights reform, he knew it would cost him Southern support. But where Lyndon leaned on political force, Lady Bird leaned on empathy and human connection. Lady Bird knew that Southern white Americans would not be swayed by speeches from Washington politicians. They needed to hear from someone who understood them, someone who shared their experiences and could speak to them on their level. So, Lady Bird did something that no First Lady before her had done. She embarked on a multi-state speaking tour of the South to confront the issue head-on. She didn't have to do it. It wasn't her official duty as First Lady, But Lady Bird understood that her voice could reach places Lyndon's could not. She traveled through Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and other southern states, often to towns where white residents were still deeply resistant to civil rights reform. Unlike her husband, she didn't rely on speeches that lectured the South. Instead, she spoke plainly, with the warmth and familiarity of a neighbor. Her speeches acknowledged their fears, but she also challenged them. She framed racial equality not as a threat, but as a moral necessity, tying it to Southern values of decency and faith. Her presence alone was significant. Here was a white Southern woman, an emblem of Southern womanhood, asking her fellow white Southerners to support desegregation. Her mere presence put pressure on audiences to listen. They couldn't dismiss her as an outsider or a radical. She was one of them. Her speeches were compassionate but firm, offering moral clarity where so many others had failed. But the tour wasn't without backlash. In one of the more dramatic moments of the trip, a small group of white protesters heckled Lady Bird during a stop in South Carolina. They waved Confederate flags and held signs that read, "We don't want your Yankee ideas." But she never wavered. She continued speaking, calm and composed, never raising her voice. Her strength was rooted in quiet confidence, and it had a powerful effect on those watching. Her role in civil rights didn't end with speeches. Behind the scenes, she advised Lyndon on how to address Southern governors and state officials. She knew how to frame the issue in terms they would understand. Lady Bird's perspective as a Southern woman, and one who understood the region's resistance to change, allowed her to provide insight that no other advisor could offer. Her quiet influence in these moments shaped how the White House approached the issue of civil rights, especially when it came to persuading reluctant Southern Democrats to support the bills. Lady Bird's influence extended far beyond civil rights and beautification. She was also an integral part of shaping LBJ's Great Society agenda, which included sweeping reforms in healthcare, education, and poverty reduction. Her influence on education policy was especially significant. As a former teacher and lifelong advocate for literacy, Lady Bird believed that education was the key to addressing poverty and inequality. She pushed for early childhood education initiatives, which eventually influenced the development of Head Start, one of the most enduring legacies of the Great Society. Her influence was also felt in how Lyndon prioritized environmental issues. Lady Bird believed that social justice and environmental justice were linked. If communities were cleaner, safer, and more beautiful, then people would take more pride in their surroundings. That's why she didn't just push for flowers along highways. She advocated for better urban planning, green spaces in cities, and the reduction of industrial eyesores in poor communities. Her ideas later informed parts of the Urban Mass Transportation Act, which funded modern public transit systems in cities. Her influence was quiet, but constant. Lady Bird wasn't the type to demand credit, but those in the know were well aware of her role in guiding the administration's broader goals. As Jack Valenti would later say, Lady Bird was the ballast in the boat. She kept us steady, she kept us focused, and she knew what really mattered. Lady Bird Johnson's role as First Lady was not symbolic, it was strategic. She influenced policy, advised her husband, and used her relationships with advisors like Valenti and Moyers to quietly push through transformative reforms. From civil rights to beautification, Lady Bird Johnson shaped the Johnson White House in ways that few First Ladies ever had. Her legacy is still visible today. Every wildflower-lined highway, every Head Start classroom, and every conversation about how aesthetics influence public pride owes a debt to Lady Bird's vision. She understood that power didn't have to be loud to be effective. Where LBJ wielded power like a hammer, Lady Bird wielded it like a gardener, patiently planting seeds, tending to them, and letting them grow into something far more lasting. Her story is a reminder that power comes in many forms. It isn't always in the speeches or the spotlight. Sometimes it's in the quiet conversations on White House lawns. It's in the persistence of a First Lady who fought for something as simple as a flower, and as profound as human dignity. So what can we make of Lady Bird Johnson's legacy? Was she a woman navigating the tides of power, or was she steering the ship herself? Her relationships with Valenti and Moyers were the subject of whispers, but it's undeniable that they were also alliances of influence. She wasn't just the First Lady. She was a political force in her own right. From her environmental work to her role as a key figure in civil rights, Lady Bird Johnson's impact on America is still visible today, literally, as you drive down a flower-lined highway. Her influence wasn't always loud, but it was lasting. And maybe that's the most powerful kind of legacy. Our time is up for today's episode. Thanks for joining me on Whispers of the White House. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please leave a review and subscribe. And don't miss my other show, The Wisdom of Sex, where I explore all things relationship, and Tales on the Couch, where true love collides with true crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay wise, and don't believe every whisper you hear.